All right, y'all, in the year 2025, we are talking about a disease that in the year 2000, we essentially eliminated here in this country. And 25 years later, not only am I having to talk about the third and fourth outbreak in this year alone, but I'm actually having to discuss the fact that it claimed its first death in over a decade here in this country. Yes, that's right. I am talking about the measles disease. And again, this is a disease that if I told you that we actually don't even have a treatment for, you might be startled. Like a disease that we got rid of essentially in 2000 that we don't necessarily have a treatment for in 2025 has now claimed its first two deaths in over a decade. And unfortunately, the only thing we have to blame is misinformation and disinformation. So let's talk about the measles. Let's talk about what we have to be concerned about. And of course, for our unvaccinated crew, because those are the ones that are being infected. So what do we know? And now we know we have over 200 cases of measles confirmed and diagnosed in Texas and New Mexico. We know that the majority of the people who are affected by the measles outbreak, this most recent one, and this is true for every time we have a measles outbreak, are unvaccinated individuals. We know that the two people who died from this most recent measles outbreak, both children, both unvaccinated. When you hear, right, like kind of that pattern that, oh, we've got a measles outbreak. Oh, majority are unvaccinated. Oh, majority are children. That should give you some pause. But unfortunately, because of, this, again, almost like 2-decade run of misinformation, disinformation, especially associated with the MMR vaccine, here we are today having to bury kids because they don't have a treatment. And why don't they have a treatment, Dr. Pierre? Because this is a disease that we essentially eradicated here in this country in 2000. Like I was talking to an infectious disease friend of mine, right, who noted that, hey, you know what? We don't even have treatment options for it. All of it is supportive care. For those who may not necessarily be in medicine, which I know most of you guys who are watching or listening to this are not necessarily in medicine, supportive care means, hey, you know what? If you need some fluids, I can give you some IV fluids. If you need, a machine to breathe for you, I can help that machine breathe for you. If you got some pain medication, I can give you some pain. It's just supportive care. It's just almost like a pat on the back that we have because we don't have options. We've never needed these options. Y'all know I like to get on my capitalistic soapbox. If you are a pharmaceutical company, right? Like let's say you're in one of these pharmaceutical companies, why would you invest money in a disease that was essentially eradicated? Let's just think about that. Like if you are a pharmaceutical company, you aren't going to invest money in a treatment in a disease that is essentially eradicated, especially here in this country, because you're not going to make any money from it. So we've had to get about 2 decades worth of time to say, hey, you know what? You know what really works very well against people getting the measles vaccine? Getting vaccinated. Like that's worked very, very well. But unfortunately, because of the misinformation, disinformation associated with the vaccine, and amongst other things, people and parents are electing not to get their kids vaccinated. And now what happens is now they're putting their kids, themselves, and everyone else at harm. Like I've mentioned this when I talk about COVID. One of the biggest issues with COVID, especially those who are COVID deniers, anti-vaxxers alike, is that they want the ability to say, hey, like if I get COVID, let me deal with it. But they don't want to protect everyone else who may also be affected by their decision. The same thing with our measles. You want the decision to say, hey, you know what? I want to make the decision to declare that, you know what? My kids aren't getting vaccinated. Understandably. But when your kids get sick, you need to keep your kids away from everyone else, including adults, including other kids. But they don't want to do that. They want their kids to be able to go to any daycare, any school, like go out into the public, right? Even though they're at the most severe risk for this communicable disease. Because what tends to happen when it does pick up, when it does hit them across the face, what tends to happen is they're the only ones affected. And a few choice people, especially those who are maybe immunocompromised, even though they got vaccinated, elderly and other kids, they're the ones who take the blame. And I just want to think about this, right? I saw someone say like, oh, they should have like measles parties, like what they used to do with chickenpox. And if you're unfamiliar with what that means, before we had a vaccine for chickenpox, I want y'all to put it out there because we have a vaccine for chickenpox, which is why we don't have these things anymore. Families would have chickenpox parties for their siblings. And the reason why they would do that is because chickenpox was so contagious that if one sibling got it, it was likelihood that other people were going to get it. So they're like, hey, you know what? Whatchamacallit, Sammy just picked up chickenpox. If they haven't picked up chickenpox yet, let's just get this thing over with and let's put them all together. That's essentially what they used to do with these chickenpox parties. Thankfully, we don't have to do that no more because we have a vaccine that says, hey, you know what? If you take this vaccine, you're not going to have to develop that, right? Like we have treatment, right? That's our treatment option. But people would rather have a so-called treatment option after the fact, which again makes no sense because in a case like measles, there is no treatment option after the fact. There is just that. Like, hey, you now have measles and you have to deal with all of the complications associated with measles. And that's something we need to talk about. So before I get into the conversation of, what happens when someone gets measles, because that's the question I'm getting in my comments now, like, hey, you know what? How do you know if you got the measles, right? Because that's what people want to know. Let's go back, right? Let's start where it first began, right? Let's start, and again, I talk about this, right? We have peer-reviewed articles that came out, and this is where the MMR vaccine and autism first got its, birth, where you had this peer-reviewed article that looked at the MMR vaccine, looked at autism rates, and made some calculation that they were related. That article was later found to be refuted. But unfortunately, people always say this, right? The lie travels much faster than the truth. So by the time the lie got out about this MMR vaccine and autism, correlation, you had celebrities and just people all alike champion the fact that like, oh my God, we have to get away from this vaccine, right? Because it's causing autism. They did not want to hear like, hey, by the way, like that article that y'all read, it was based on faulty information. It was actually false and none of it makes sense. And even though we've had subsequent, and I do mean subsequent, follow-up studies to show like, oh yeah, there's no correlation with this vaccine and autism. You still have people to this day, because unfortunately, we live in a silo. You have people to this day still assuming and thinking that the MMR vaccine is responsible for autism. And because of that, and they say, I don't want that vaccine or the other vaccines. Guess what happens? The MMR, one of the M's is measles. Right. So now you have this like resurgence of measles, and these measles outbreaks typically happen in pockets because of how contagious it is. When one kid has it, everyone gets it, right? Everyone in the school, everyone in the church, right? Because there's a lot of religious, correlation for those who are associated with not getting vaccinated. In fact, what happened in Texas, right? What happened in Texas, there was a big church, right, where the pastor was big on, I'm not going to advocate for kids getting vaccinated. The pastor. Why would a pastor who has no science background have such strong opinions? Neither here or there, but they did. A lot of people rely on their pastor as their kind of religious leader to say, hey, I'm going to follow their lead. So if the pastor's saying don't get vaccinated, guess what? Hey, you know what, kids? You aren't getting vaccinated either. And then, of course, what happens when this outbreak occurs, when 200 plus people end up getting measles, the same pastor is like, hey, you know what? It's up to the parents. It's not really on me. So now this pastor has to help the parents bury their child, right? And now wants no responsibility from it. My biggest issue with those who are very vocal with their stances, that when hits the fan, this is a PG show, right? So we won't curse, right? But when blank hits the fan, those same people are silent, are absent. In fact, those same people, when you look across your timeline, no one's championing being anti-vax, right? All of a sudden, it's not cool to be anti-vax because you have a current outbreak. The second this outbreak dies down, you will see those same people start picking their cameras back up. They'll start typing and they'll start blogging away. But every time we have an outbreak like such, those people tend to run away, right? And they're silent. I don't let them run away. I run towards them. I say, hey, by the way, come back. Like, remember, doctors like myself who are promoting the MMR vaccine are evil. What do you tell the parent that has to bury their child, right? Because 2 children have passed away. What do you tell them now about that evil vaccine, right? And they're always silent. This is why it's so dangerous where we get our information from. Because if you're in a silo and the only thing you hear is like this religious leader say, hey, you know what, I'm only going to follow this religious leader. When the blank hits the fan, all of a sudden that religious leader wants no responsibility, wants to put all of the responsibility back on you. This is where we are in 2025. I've touched on multiple measles outbreaks throughout the country. Like I'm looking now, we have looks like there's 10 other states that are affected by this Texas and New Mexico outbreak. Reason why is because it's contagious, because, these people don't realize they have it, right? They're spreading it out. They're traveling. They're going to schools. All of these things kind of happen. And all of a sudden, if you were in this place for this amount of time frame, you are at risk for developing measles. These are the news reports that are coming out now. And it all started because someone had measles and everyone else got sick. I want folks to understand that like these measles outbreak didn't come out of nowhere. There is an origin story behind the measles outbreak. And that's kind of why we're here today, right? To understand like, yes, it's here again. We don't have no treatment and we won't have no treatment because despite the fact that we have these multiple measles outbreak, despite the fact that kids are dying, not enough people are dying. And I hate to say it, not enough people are dying, not enough people are getting sick. And I'm sorry, let's be honest. If you are a pharmaceutical company and your primary audience for treatment were people who are anti-vax, which means they likely aren't going to partake in any treatment you offer anyways, especially if it's vaccine like injectable related. They already aren't going to participate in anyways. Guess what? I'm not spending no money for that, right? I'm not going to invest any research for that. So another kid is going to have to die because parents decided, you know what? I'm not going to vaccinate my kid. And that's kind of where we're at right now, right? And again, I like this, right? Because this was a note. These outbreaks occur. What tends to happen? Travel bans, school alerts, increased emergency room visits, things that the anti-vaxxers, who again, don't really like the medical system anyway, want to avoid at all costs. But now it's right there at the doorstep. Like, hey, you wanted to, be anti-vax. Guess what? Now you can't go anywhere. Guess what? Now you're having to go to the hospital. And I can tell you, because that contagious as it is, guess what? If a person, these ER docs even think you might be developing measles, you best believe you are quarantined out the wazoo. No one's coming to see you. No one's coming to talk to you. They're going to be super masked up, and gowned up and protect. Like this is what happens, right, when you make their decisions. And I feel bad for the kids. That's who I feel bad for. I don't feel bad for the parents. I feel bad for the kids because the kids don't really have a choice. This is a fact that I don't think people realize. When you have to go to a school, right, post-secondary education, college and whatnot, they're going to ask for your vaccination records. And why are they going to do that? Because they're not going to willingly bring someone who may be highly contagious to their school. So guess what tends to happen for a lot of kids who grew up not being vaccinated? They end up having to get vaccinated just to go to school. It may not be in huge numbers, but it is what it is, right? Because everyone else has the common sense and wherewithal to understand that, hey, you're taking this not because, the government wants to overpower you or inject you with some GPS related medication, which is some of the craziest stuff I hear from these anti-vaxxers. It's because for the greater good, people need to be protected. So you have these parents here who are going to be bearing their child, who have probably already by the time you watch this, they've already buried their child, who have to live with the fact that their decision to not vaccinate their child is the reason why their child's not here. No other reason. Don't blame the measles, even though you can. It was the precipitating factor. They have to live with the fact that they are the reason why their child isn't here anymore, because they ran with misinformation, disinformation, or they listened to a religious leader who should not have been given any type of advice, but gave the advice. And then here we are. And what's so funny, that religious leader pointed out that said, hey, you know what? I know RFK is, he's our head of human health services now. And I'm going to listen to his thought. And what did RFK say? Get the vaccine, right? And what's comical, right? And I say this all the time, and I've been saying this, especially with my anti-vaxxers for the COVID folks, is that you have folks who are some of the staunch opponents of getting vaccinated who are also vaccinated. People who are like a President Trump, RFK, who are like, no, and it should be your choice, couldn't wait to get vaccinated against COVID, are all vaccinated against the MMR vaccine, every single one of them. So when you hear these people who are like staunch advocates of not protecting themselves, they're only saying that to you, right? They themselves are protected, and they themselves, the second any of their loved ones or family gets sick, will run to a treatment immediately. right? So it is very important, especially here in the Lunch and Learn community. I stress this. It's very important to be able to take information, but to be able to do some homework on your own. I say this all the time, right? Like, empower yourself for better health. Even the stuff that I'm saying today, I want you to say, you know what? Dr. Berry said that there's no treatment options for measles, but let me go test that out. Let me go do my research. Dr. Berry said that, the MMR vaccine and autism, there is no correlation. Let me go check that out myself, right? I want you guys to make your own informed decisions, because this is what happens. Because when it hits the fan, those same people who told you don't do this, don't do that, are nowhere to be found. And the only people who are still around to be found are the ones who have to risk themselves, their family, to take care of you. And that's something that, again, I don't want no parts of, at least voluntarily, right? Again, I'm an internist. I take care of people who I got to take care of. But you best believe if I'm taking care of you, right, and you're not vaccinated, I'm going to ask, why didn't you get vaccinated? I'm going to see where was the education gap that occurred that said, you know what, I didn't get vaccinated for A, B, C, or D. I just want to know. So I think that's why it's so important when we think about, all diseases, but especially this measles, right? When we think about it, it's like, hey, am I doing everything I can to prevent myself from getting measles, from getting sick from measles, and ultimately dying from measles? We just had our first 2 deaths in over a decade from measles in a child. And this is what happens, right, when misinformation bleeds through. There are a lot of people are not here today to listen or watch me because they listen to misinformation and disinformation. And because they did so, COVID took them out. There are a lot of people who are not here today. There are a lot of family members that are not here today because misinformation and disinformation plays such a significant role in their life that they're no longer here to tell about it. And I don't want that to be for you, right? So let me give just a quick little wrap up on what can we do, right? Because that's the question, right? Like, hey, Dr. Berry, what can I do knowing that these measles outbreaks keep popping up and they're just going to continue to keep popping up? All right, so the first thing that you can do, right, is you got to get vaccinated, right? And of course, obviously, I'm talking to those who are not vaccinated, right? You have to get vaccinated. Vaccination remains the cornerstone of preventing measles. That should be the end sentence right there. That should be, click that up right there. Vaccines remain the cornerstone of prevention of measles, not, any supplement or mineral or any other random thing you want to put in your body, which again is always so comical that anti-vaxxers have no problem putting other things in their body to avoid getting the vaccine. Always a comical situation, but here we are. Make sure your vaccines are up to date because you can get what we say almost like a booster, right? So maybe the titers, you got them young, right? Because most people got them when they're kids, but maybe you need an MMR booster, right? Think about that, right? Get up, make sure you have your vaccines up to date. There are blood tests for that. And I think outreach from a communication standpoint, from a community standpoint, and education is so important. Like, you're going to have to see, like, you may be living in areas where the vaccination rates are so low that the risk of you, a person who might be vaccinated against MMR, could possibly pick it up, right? Because think about this. If you've been vaccinated against disease, and because you've been vaccinated, you've never had to deal with it, and then a person who's not been vaccinated with a disease gets the disease, your body may not necessarily, your body be like, oh, I've been vaccinated against something like this. This looks familiar. Now, while it's doing that, it may cause you some ill effects, right? You may get the skin lesions. You may get the respiratory distress related issues, right? You may have some ill effects while your body is fighting it. Thankfully, because you had a vaccine, your body can fight it. Unlike them, but you don't want to have to go through that, do you? Right? You don't want to have to go through the ill effects. So, like, look in your community area to see, right? But you can check the CDC to see, hey, there are certain parts of the country where the vaccination rates are below the threshold. And what do I mean by threshold? We know that with herd immunity, and this is something you might have heard during the COVID discussions. If a significant amount of people get vaccinated against that disease won't spread. With measles, it's almost like over 90%, almost 90% of your area, right? Little county, little city, wherever you live at, like, has to be vaccinated against disease to decrease the chance of it spreading out like across the city, which is why these pockets tend to occur, because typically the one person who, let's say patient A who has the measles, who's developed the measles, they're in close proximity to people who aren't vaccinated. And because they're in close proximity to people who aren't vaccinated, guess what happens? They all get the disease. And then whoever they're in close proximity all get the disease. This may sound familiar because this is how our conversation with COVID works, right? But then they hit a wall of people who are vaccinated. And when they hit that wall, guess what happens, right? It stays amongst yourselves. Like, hey, all these people here are vaccinated. We can't jump over to them, so we're going to stay right here, which is why it tends to happen in these pockets, in these religious sects. It tends to stay in that box because there's an eventual point that it hits the spread where everyone else around them are actually vaccinated and it doesn't jump to them, right? Which is why COVID was so bad, right? Because there was no wall, right? Before the vaccine, it was boop, boop. It just kept going. It just kept on going because there was no wall of protection. Now, thankfully, right, as we're going on to a year, wow, we're almost a year 5, year 6 of the COVID. As we, continue to move in our COVID journey, like post-pandemic, because so many people are vaccinated, right, it's the reason why, like, it stops and it kind of regresses, right? Now, of course, obviously, we have our bimodal peaks, but like it kind of is what it is, right? So if I can't get nothing else through you guys, if you're asking yourself, am I at risk for getting this measles, right? You have to ask yourself 2 things, right? Well, really 1 thing, right? Am I vaccinated against measles? That's your number 1 question. Am I vaccinated against measles? Am I a child, right? Someone under 18, right? Those are the 2 questions you got to ask yourself. Because if you fall into those 2 barriers, or if you're significantly older, right, and your immune system is lower, those questions you got to ask yourself, because that is what a person who has high risk of developing measles, that's the boat that they're going to be in. So if you're not in that boat, right, you're vaccinated, right, you're in a good community where the significant percentage of people are vaccinated, you stand a pretty good chance. Right? Now, of course, obviously, travel is travel. This is why I say the people who make these decisions, right? And they always say it's a personal decision that I make it myself. They don't care that their personal decision affects everyone. They'll be the ones who, have close contact with people who are measles, and then they got to go out on a trip somewhere. So now everyone who is on the plane get affected. Everyone who's on the bus gets affected. Everyone who's in the school gets affected. They typically don't care about the outward effects, right? Their decision, right? It's only, hey, I got to make my decision. Right. But again, the people who help make that decision for you, right? The people who put it in your brain, right? That like, hey, being vaccinated isn't the thing. Don't do that. They're putting mercury in it. They're putting GPS in it. They're changing your DNA. All of the other craziness that we hear associated with vaccines, but especially with the MMR vaccine, those people are never around. And it's typically just people like me educating you and say, hey guys, we got another measles outbreak. Protect yourself until this one dies down. And then we have to worry about the next. And of course, I think the one in Texas got the most fanfare, right? Because a child died for the first time in over a decade, right? Like, I think that was the big, like, whoa, what are we doing here? And is this going to be a turning point? I don't know. If I have to film another one of these in 6 months, you'll know it wasn't. Right. But maybe knowing that a child is no longer here because of misinformation and disinformation, maybe that will get you or your family member or someone who's running around not vaccinated, maybe that will get them to make decisions. But what I found, unfortunately, historically, that if it doesn't affect that person directly, they typically don't listen.